Caitlin Clark narrative doesn't make sense because we're being told one story, but when you actually watch what's happening, it doesn't line up. Caitlin Clark is being called entitled, and maybe the most important part of that story is not whether the label is fair. It is why that label keeps appearing even when the visible evidence refuses to cooperate. Because that is the strange part here. If there were obvious tension, if there were cold shoulders on the bench, awkward interviews, bad body language, broken chemistry on the floor, then the conversation would at least have something concrete to hold on to.
I actually was supposed to tell them a little bit about what has taken place over the last 48 hours, and that is people have fought. Like, when you enter into the league.
But that is not what people are seeing. What people are seeing publicly is normal interaction, functional chemistry, teammates playing basketball, no unmistakable rupture, no smoking gun. So the real question is no longer, is Caitlin Clark entitled? The real question is, are people uncovering a conflict or manufacturing one? And that distinction matters, because once a player gets assigned a character flaw, the sports conversation stops being about basketball and starts becoming about narrative management. Every look becomes a signal. Every rumor becomes evidence. Every neutral moment gets reread as hidden drama. And suddenly the player is not being evaluated on what is happening. She is being evaluated on what people have decided must be happening underneath it. That is where this gets interesting, because entitled is not a neutral word. It is a loaded one. It is not just criticism. It is a personality sentence. It tells the audience how to interpret everything that follows. If a player is called emotional, you still have room to debate performance. If a player is called inconsistent, you can still track the game. But if a player is called entitled, now the audience is being invited to see ambition as arrogance, confidence as disrespect, attention as something she thinks she deserves. That word does not describe behavior. It organizes resentment. And when a label like that starts circulating without a visible public event to anchor it, you have to ask whether the label is emerging from reality, or whether reality is being bent around the label. Because this is how modern sports narratives often work. The conclusion arrives first. The evidence gets searched for later. People hear locker room rumors, and that phrase does a lot of work all by itself. It creates the aura of inside knowledge. It suggests hidden truth. It gives the audience permission to believe something serious is going on, even when they cannot actually see it. But rumors are powerful for a reason. They fill empty space. And empty space is exactly what exists when there is no definitive public conflict to point to. So into that space goes projection. Projection from fans who are already uncomfortable with how quickly Clark changed the center of gravity around women's basketball. Projection from commentators who know that tension travels faster than nuance. Projection from people who confuse attention with favoritism and visibility with ego. Once a player becomes culturally oversized, she stops being treated like a player and starts being treated like a referendum. And Caitlin Clark is not just a player in this conversation. She is a symbol carrying too many arguments at once. That is part of why this keeps happening around her. She represents hype, attention, ratings, new audiences, old resentments, generational change, media overexposure, fan tribalism, and the uncomfortable question of who gets embraced and who gets policed. So when people call her entitled, they may think they are making an observation about one athlete. But often, they are really expressing something broader. Fatigue with the machine around her, discomfort with her prominence, or frustration with what she represents in the larger hierarchy of the sport. And that is where the story becomes less about Clark's behavior and more about the ecosystem around her. Because the ecosystem needs conflict. It feeds on it. A harmonious team dynamic is not as clickable as a fractured one. Quiet professionalism does not generate as much debate as rumored resentment. The camera can show players laughing, competing, communicating. But if the audience has already been primed to look for hostility, then normal behavior starts being read as performance. See? They're trying too hard to look fine. That is the trap. Once a narrative becomes emotionally satisfying, contradictory evidence does not kill it. It gets absorbed into it. That is why this story has staying power even without visible proof. And there is another layer here that is worth saying directly. Women athletes are very often judged through personality narratives faster than men are. Not because men do not get criticized, they absolutely do, but because women are frequently expected to balance excellence with likability in a way that turns every social dynamic into public property. Confidence must be measured. Ambition must be softened. Visibility must be earned over and over again. If you are too assertive, you are difficult. If you are too celebrated, you are overrated. If you are too certain, you are entitled. That word becomes a containment strategy. It is a way of disciplining scale, a way of saying, yes, you are talented, but do not get too comfortable with what that talent brings. Do not seem too aware of your value. Do not seem too central. Do not look like you expect to matter. And this is where the Clark conversation becomes more revealing about the audience than the athlete. Because what exactly are people reacting to? Are they reacting to something she has clearly done in this specific FIBA context? Or are they reacting to the accumulated irritation that comes with being the face of a phenomenon? Those are not the same thing. One is evidence-based criticism. The other is backlash searching for a language that sounds legitimate. Entitled is useful because it feels specific while remaining blurry. It sounds like character analysis, but it often operates like vibe detection. It gives people a moral vocabulary without requiring a factual standard. And in the absence of open conflict, that vagueness becomes the whole game. Now, to be fair, not every locker room tension becomes public. Teams can be functional on the court and complicated behind the scenes. Athletes are professionals. Chemistry does not have to mean friendship. A smooth possession does not prove emotional harmony. That part is true. Public normalcy is not definitive proof that private dynamics are perfect. But that cuts both ways. If we are being honest, private tension also cannot be treated as fact just because it sounds plausible to people already inclined to believe it. You do not get to leap from, we cannot know everything, to, therefore the negative story is probably true. That is not analysis. That is preference disguised as skepticism. And I think that is the core of this whole situation. The Clark entitled narrative feels less like a revelation and more like a solution. It solves a discomfort. It gives critics a way to explain her visibility without having to engage the full complexity of why she attracts so much attention. It turns a structural conversation into a personal one. Instead of asking how media systems distort players, or how fan cultures create rivalry theater, or how sports discourse rewards conflict over accuracy, the conversation gets compressed into a simpler claim. Maybe she is just the problem. That is a much easier story to tell. It is also a much weaker one. Because if the strongest evidence people have is rumor, mood, and the assumption that extraordinary attention must have gone to her head, then what they are really defending is not truth, but plausibility. And plausibility is dangerous in sports media, because once a narrative feels plausible enough, people stop checking whether it is actually supported. Then the cycle begins. A vague rumor becomes online chatter. Online chatter becomes a talking point. A talking point becomes a lens. And the lens starts rewriting what everyone sees. Now, a routine substitution is body language analysis. A missed pass is disrespect. A neutral quote is coded tension. A normal team interaction becomes suspicious specifically because it looks normal. At that point, the narrative is no longer being tested. It is being protected. And that is why this matters beyond Caitlin Clark. Because every era picks certain athletes to turn into symbolic battlegrounds. Not just stars, battlegrounds. Players onto whom the sport projects all of its unresolved anxieties. About fame, about hierarchy, about who gets accelerated, about who gets celebrated, about whether visibility is earned by performance alone or by forces people do not fully trust. Once that happens, the athlete is trapped inside a conversation that was never entirely about them to begin with. Clark is in that zone now. So when people hear she is entitled, they should not only ask whether the claim is true, They should ask what emotional need the claim is serving. Whose frustration does it soothe? What imbalance does it explain away? What tension in the culture of the sport does it help people avoid naming directly? Because sometimes a narrative spreads not because it reveals something hidden, but because it gives a scattered audience a common language for their discomfort. That is what this looks like. Not proof, not exposure, a coordination of suspicion, and the biggest tell is still the same one we started with. The visible material does not match the intensity of the accusation. That does not automatically clear anyone, but it should slow people down. It should make them more careful. Because when the available evidence is ordinary but the interpretation is explosive, that usually means the story is being inflated by forces outside the frame. And those forces are powerful. Media incentives, fan insecurity, symbolic politics, and the irresistible temptation to reduce a complicated rise into a personality flaw. Maybe there is private friction. Maybe there are moments the public has not seen. That possibility exists. But possibility is not proof, and suspicion is not substance. The burden should still be on the narrative to show itself, not on the audience to complete it from fragments. That is the deeper issue here. A created narrative does not need hard evidence. It only needs enough emotional logic to feel true. And once that happens, the athlete is not playing against defenders anymore. She is playing against interpretation. That is a much harder game to win because even looking composed can be used against you, especially when people have already decided that what they are watching is not behavior, but theater. So maybe the story here is not that Caitlin Clark's public image is finally revealing some hidden arrogance. Maybe the story is that a lot of people were waiting for a word like entitled because it gives them a cleaner way to process a player whose impact arrived faster than the culture around her was prepared to handle. That is a very different story, and it is also the more unsettling one because it suggests the narrative is not uncovering reality. It is trying to control it. Courtside leaks will keep following this because the most important part of a sports story is often the part that is never officially announced. The moment a player stops being covered and starts being interpreted. And if you have been watching this situation closely, you already know that line has been crossed. This story is still moving, and we will be tracking what happens next.